Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DaCosta. Thank you for joining me today on my show. I am cruising with some consistent preterism today. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about, excuse me, dang cough. Pardon me. What I wanted to talk about today is Adam. A little bit about Adam just while I'm rolling. And I wanted to talk about the passage in Isaiah 43:27 a little bit and sort of connect it to other places. But the passage in Isaiah 43:27, speaking to Israel, says, "Your first father sinned, and your mediators have transgressed against me." But before I did that, before I wanted to get into that, I wanted to take the time to address something that's quite interesting. And those of you who have followed along my journey and my interactions with the quote-unquote big dogs of full preterism know that I've been very active in going over to their pages, at least while I could, and their channels, I should say, and confronting them on their YouTube videos, and going right to the heart of the issue and pressing them on some problems, some major problems that they have no answers for. And eventually what ended up happening very quickly, it wasn't more than maybe a few interactions that I got banned, but I got blocked, and they won't allow me to comment on any videos. So Don K. Preston blocked me, William Bell blocked me, Joel Sexton blocked me, what's his name? Dr. Wayne Critchfield blocked me. I haven't checked to see if Berean Bible Church blocked me. I think Daniel Rogers blocked me. Tom Mills blocked me. So the point that I'm trying to get at here is that I've been blocked more times than, I say this a lot, but Dikembe Mutombo blocking someone in the NBA. But it's kind of telling, obviously, because first of all, they say that IO is false and consistent preterism is false, yet they don't want to engage me for their audiences to see, because the couple times that I have engaged them, I've gained a lot of new subscribers from those few interactions. Each time it jumped up 10, 15 people, but hey, whatever they want to do, it's their channel. That if they want to block me and be dishonest, they can live with that, and it can eat at them. But I did receive an email from a lady who obviously enjoys and listens and agrees with my stuff a couple days ago, and she informed me that she one morning went over to Preston's YouTube and left a comment, and told him that I guess she appreciated his work. It wasn't mean at all. Very, very polite. She made it sure that she was, because she's listening to me being banned from Preston's channel. And so anyways, she tells me, she leaves this comment that says, I appreciate your work, but I think that your attention should go towards disproving the IO viewpoint, as it makes a lot of good points, very strong points. And then she mentioned me, and she said that she linked, I believe it was my Why Are There Predestined Gentiles teachings, and she asked Don to do a critique of it. Now that video is probably 10, 12 minutes long. It's not very long, but she made a very polite and cordial request that Don would critique my video and offer up some, information as to why it's wrong. So, the request went out. Sorry, I just got a quick phone call. The request went out for him to do a critique on it, and not only did he not respond to her, but he didn't even allow the comment on the page. And I guess that means he blocked her as well. I'm not sure. But, why would you not allow someone's polite and cordial request on your comments? I mean, it seems to me that these guys don't want anybody to hear my name, to hear that, I'm doing audios or I'm doing teachings on my channel. They don't want to draw any attention to it. And they sure as heck don't want to be put on the spot to do a critique of it. William Bell made the terrible mistake of doing a critique of my critique on him. And it just really backfired and blew up in his face. And people saw that his arguments are laughable. They're stretched. They don't make any sense. And they go against the whole objective of the Great Commission, which was to regather the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So, long story short, I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and maybe, you guys can ask him about it, since I have no way of contacting him other than via email, and I'm definitely not going to do that. But, excuse me. I would like to really know why he won't even allow the words to be mentioned in the comments. Like, hey, Don, can you please do a critique of this short 10-minute audio? But instead, he's going to sit there and teach on bold judgments and refute books from futurists who are waiting for, Jesus to fly down in a helicopter, taking bullets off the chest like Rambo. All right, it just makes no sense. It's played out. Nobody wants to hear it anymore. They want to hear you take down the obvious problems, the obvious elephants in the room that the consistent preterist position brings to light. But anyways, enough about all that. Just figured I'd bring that to your attention so you can really see how obvious it is that these guys want nothing to do with this dilemma. But anyways, back to Adam. So the verse is Isaiah 43:27. Now, it says, speaking to Israel, your first father sinned and your mediators transgressed against me. Now, I've heard some really silly viewpoints on this. Some people say it's Abraham who sinned, the first father, but Abraham throughout this whole story is pictured as a man of righteousness, a man of faith. And he's mentioned so many times in that position that to think that they would refer to him as their first father who sinned just really makes no sense. Some people have said it's other people that I don't even bother reading it because it really is just silly. It's like people do any and everything they can to avoid what is so clear and so fluid in the text. The first father who sinned in the story is Adam, right? There is no other way around that. If you go to the story, okay, the first father in the story who sinned is Adam. All right, there's no way, there's no chance getting around that. Okay, this story begins in the garden with Adam, who was the foundation, the first patriarch mentioned in the line, and he was the first one who sinned and brought death to the people. All right, so Adam is the first father who sinned. Abraham is never so much as even mentioned as the first father who sinned. Furthermore, this isn't some idea that I've conjured up. This is actually an idea that a lot of confused futurist scholars and other people alike actually hold. It's sort of a mixed bag on who they believe Isaiah 43:27 is speaking of. Some believe it's Adam, some believe it's Abraham, some believe it's someone else, but Adam is in the mix, so it's not out in left field. But obviously we know from places like Luke 2, I believe it is, where the genealogical line of Jesus is mentioned, the line goes all the way back to Adam. He's the first in line. He's the first father. We know that, we know that when Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees in the last days, he told them that their father Cain was guilty of the blood that was shed on the earth. In other words, Abel's blood. So that means that Cain had sinned and was guilty for it. So Jesus is referring back to their father Cain, one in their fatherly line, who was guilty of a sin. So that takes the sin of one of their fathers back long before Abraham even existed. So we know it has to precede Abraham because Cain's sin is mentioned and Jesus refers to him as a father of Israel. All right, and then if we take that back even further, we get to the very beginning of this story with Adam, whose sin is of utmost importance and whose sin is the focal point of the whole ministry of condemnation and death. All right, it's where the law begins. It's where imputation of sin begins. It's where his eyes were opened. They were guilty and violated the commandment, and sin took opportunity by that commandment, and by it, they died. All right, so this whole idea that Adam was not Israel's first father who sinned is silly. Okay, and if you think about Genesis, and I take the view, like many modern scholars do, that Genesis was written during the Babylonian exile. And it just makes perfect sense that while these Jews are sitting in captivity for 70 years and with an extremely repentant and sorrowful heart, and with a feeling of, remorse and, regret about how they violated the covenant, how they sort of lost that connection and that blessedness that they had living in the promised land, and how God had judged them and pushed them out into the nations because of their, unrighteousness and because of their mishandling of his law and things of that nature. So it makes sense that they would sort of document where they came from and their story and, the early patriarchs for their people, right? And you can see very similar aspects, especially in the book of Genesis to the book of Ezekiel. And obviously we know Ezekiel was a Babylonian captivity prophet. He went to the Israelites that were in Babylonian captivity, and he prophesied to them. And that was mainly what his book was about. He was speaking of them coming back, the God breathing life into these dead bones again and taking them back to their promised land in the return to Zion. But Ezekiel uses such strong, vivid imagery that matches everything we see in Genesis. He speaks of the Garden of God. He speaks of the Garden of Eden. He speaks of the beasts of the field. There's so many different things. He speaks of Israel being pictured sort of as a man lying on the ground, dead, but when breath came into him, he came to life, and God putting flesh over the bones of Israel and bringing them to life, all symbolic of bringing them back to the land and to the return to Zion. But point is that there's a lot of similarities in the language, so it just sort of makes sense that Genesis would be written around this same time when Ezekiel was writing. And there's a lot of reasons why people believe that. You can just do some research on it, but some of the things that are mentioned in Genesis could only be known during the time of the captivity, and there's a lot of little hidden things in the book of Genesis that you can find that tie it to the Babylonian captivity as well. And it just flat out makes sense, right? The Jews are writing their patriarchal backstory while they're in captivity, and they would obviously not be concerned with where pagans came from and where the rest of humanity came from. They would be concerned with their heritage, where they came from, how they got under the law, how they came into covenant with God, their first father, and so on and so forth. So from a very logical standpoint, it makes way more sense to me that this book of Genesis was written by a collection of different people during the Babylonian captivity rather than by one dude, Moses, who just decided he was going to write for his entire life about all of the miracles and stuff that he did, and write in the third person, and then also write about his death and how he died, and then he continues writing somehow after he's dead. This is just, fundamental Christianity at best. But so we got Adam as the first father of Israel who sinned, and you have these people who deny that, right? But now let me ask you a question. Did Paul know what Isaiah said? Of course he did, right? Paul the apostle quoted from the book of Isaiah plenty of times. Just go look at the book of Romans, and specifically, chapters 9, 10, 11. You have plenty of passages of him quoting Isaiah the prophet, okay? So Paul in Romans chapter 5, okay, when speaking of the death that came to let's back that up a little bit. All right, let's back that up to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul is writing to the Corinthians. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul is speaking of the law. And Paul speaks of the law, and he calls the law the ministry of death. He also calls the law the ministry of condemnation. Okay, and condemnation means to sentence or to punish, to punish someone by sentencing them to something. So you're condemned, right? And that's what the law did. Paul flat out calls the law the ministry of condemnation because it punished people, it sentenced people, and that's exactly what a law does today. When you violate the law and you go to court, you stand before a judge, which is the throne room, the papers are opened or the books are opened, and you're judged according to your works done in relation to the law. So if you violated the law, you're going to be judged accordingly, and that's exactly what the Great Throne Judgment was all about in the end. So it really makes sense if you look at the judgment story in that sort of light. So, but the point here is that the law is specifically called by Paul the ministry of death and the ministry of condemnation. Now, those two words are super key, okay? You need to understand and you need to keep those at the forefront of your mind. Death is the first word, death, okay? And condemnation is the second word. So Paul outlines what the law brought. It brought death and it brought condemnation to those who were under it. Like Paul says elsewhere in Galatians 3, the law was the curse, and as many as were of the works of the law were under the curse, showing that the curse was distinctly exclusive to those who were under the law. Like he says in Romans 3, the law says what it says. The law says what it says to those who are under the law, that all the world may become guilty before God. Like Paul said in Galatians 4:5, he was born into the law to redeem those under the law. And like John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son for them. So if Jesus was born into the law to redeem those under the law, then the world that God so loved was those under the law. And that's exactly what Paul says in Romans 3, where he says the law says what it says to those who are under it, that all the world may become guilty before God. So the world was those under the law. But now keep that in mind, because Paul outlines and says flat out that the law is the death. The law brought the death, and the law brought the condemnation. Okay? Now when we go over to Romans chapter 5, we see Paul, who, again, often quoted Isaiah, and who is very familiar with Isaiah's writings, right? He refers to sin, right? Now remember, Isaiah in 43:27 says, Israel, your first father sinned. Okay? Well, Paul says in Romans 5, I believe it's verse 12, he says, through one man sin entered the world. So, do you think that Paul was in disagreement with Isaiah? In other words, was Isaiah, who was a prophet to the people of Israel, just like Paul, do you think Isaiah had a different understanding of the first father who sinned of Israel, who that was? Because Paul obviously thought it was Adam, right? In Romans 5, no one's going to deny that. Paul says flat out, through one man, and every single scholar and every single Bible pastor and every single wannabe ever understands that this is Adam, because he flat out says it. But through the one man, sin entered the world. So if one man brought sin into the world, said Paul, speaking of Adam, obviously, and if Isaiah in 43:27 says, Israel, your first father sinned, then who do you think they're talking about there? This is the same person. This is Adam. All right, and what's even more interesting is as you go on in Romans chapter 5, Paul says that it was because of that one man's sin that death came. And he also says that because of that one man's offense, condemnation came to the people. So the result of Adam's transgression in the garden was death and condemnation. The very same two things that Paul links to the law. The very same two things that Paul says the law caused. Death and condemnation. Remember, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Go read it. If the ministry or the laws written on tablets are called the ministry of death and the ministry of condemnation, then that means that that's what the law did. The law brought the death. The law brought condemnation, meaning it brought punishment, it brought sentencing, it brought guilt. And that's exactly why Paul says elsewhere that sin was in the world before the law, but wasn't imputed until the law came. The law brought condemnation. It was hanging over their heads. So, that fact shows that the law was around in the garden. It was in existence, and that's what this whole story is. That's why I repeatedly tell people that the tree of knowledge of good and evil did not create good and evil. It didn't create sin. It didn't create evil. The tree gave knowledge of already existing good and bad, or good and evil. Okay, it didn't create it. It gave knowledge of it. It illuminated it. Opened up eyes to it. It said, this is right, this is wrong. And that's the law. That's what the law does. Okay, so again, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the law. Paul says the law gives knowledge of sin. There's the knowledge. That's key. The knowledge is key. The tree gave knowledge of right and wrong. The law gave knowledge of right and wrong. All right, same thing. The tree is just being used symbolically. So the law narrative and the death and the condemnation begins in the garden. People make the blunder and say, Paul wasn't thinking about the garden. Paul wasn't linking anything to the garden when he talked. When Paul said he was alive without the law, but when the commandment came, he died, he wasn't talking about the garden. He was talking about the first, couple years of his life when he was alive without the law. That's nonsense. Paul speaks in the position of the covenant man. He speaks in the position of Adam, and he takes it back to the garden, and he says, I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, I died. So he takes you to the very picture of Adam walking in the garden no law, no imputation, no guilt, naked and unashamed, eyes closed, perfect harmony with God. But then when the commandment comes, sin lives, because the strength of sin is the law, and he dies. Right? So there's that whole picture of sin being in the world before the law, but not being imputed where there was no law. So the law began at Adam, no doubt. There's no arguing that. The condemnation, go read Romans 5:12 to like 18. The death and the condemnation began in the garden. Paul defines the law as the thing that brought the death and the condemnation. So there's no way around that. You don't have two different stories here. You don't have a death and condemnation coming in the garden by way of something totally different, by way of people's consciousness or whatever. No, you have that being sort of like the earliest picture of the whole premise of this story, that being violation of God's holy laws, bringing death to the people, bringing condemnation, bringing guilt. All right? But, again, back to the point. Paul knew very clearly that Adam was the one man who brought sin to the world, to the people of Israel. Paul preached nothing but the hope of Israel. Paul preached the hope of the fathers. Paul stood in front of the council in Acts 26 and told them, for the 12 tribes serving God earnestly day and night, look to attain the resurrection of the dead. Paul was not preaching the hope of all people. Paul was preaching the hope of the fathers, the hope of Israel. Okay? So, when Paul is speaking in Romans 5 about the death that came to the world and the condemnation that came to the world, he's speaking of those whom Christ came to die for. And that, my friends, is those under the law. Alright, that, my friends, is he was born into the law to redeem those under the law. He's the end of the law to those who believe. So, the whole argument that Adam wasn't Israel's first father is ridiculous. Alright? If you read other sources, like outer biblical sources, which I like to check every once in a while, do I hold them to the same authority as the Bible? Maybe not, but they're good to kind of get a little bit of information outside information, and see what fits and what doesn't. And in the book of Tobit, it flat out says, speaking of Israel's early ancestors, it refers all the way back to Noah. Noah was one of Israel's early ancestors, says the book of Tobit. So if Noah was one of Israel's early ancestors, and Noah came and descended from Adam, then obviously Adam was one of Israel's earlier ancestors. If not, he was the first in the storyline. He was the patriarch of the story. He was the first man who sinned, first father who sinned. All right? If you say that Isaiah would have never referred back to Adam as the first father of the Israelites who sinned, then you also have to say that Paul would have never referred back to Adam as the first father of the Israelites who sinned. But Paul does. Paul specifically, explicitly states that Adam was the one man who brought sin into the covenant world, into the law world, into the world of those under the old covenant. And it was through that transgression of that law that death and condemnation passed. So Adam is the starting point of all of this. He is the first father of Israel who sinned. And you have to deal with the genealogical line that takes it all the way back to Adam and all these other things as well. So I know this was kind of just a random audio. I didn't really prepare much for it. In fact, I had my phone in my cup holder for a good portion of that, so I hope it came out okay. But there's a lot more that can be said on this. This is just kind of like random off-the-cuff thoughts as I'm driving here. But, the point is, again, if someone's going to argue that Isaiah wouldn't be speaking of Adam, then it makes no sense for Paul to be speaking of Adam. These are both prophets to the people of Israel, all right? They were chosen by God to convey words to the people of Israel, and they both refer back to a starting point in Israel's history where sin began. And there's no other place in this story where sin began other than Adam in the garden. Anyways, I thank you all for listening. I hope this made some sense. Leave a comment, give it a like, engage, tell me what you think. And we'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.